of children with severe seizure disorders that are not treated by medication. So my work started in cannabis activism actually with veterans, veterans specifically with PTSD. And as the organizations became more supportive of them and their plight, I kind of moved over into those that really have a more difficult time expressing themselves about cannabis and seizure. So that's where I am today. And so what I'd like to do is start you off with a video that you may or may not be familiar with.
So Dr. Anslinger, what you will see in this brief presentation is remarkable. It's unlike anything that I, in my 30 years of medical practice, have experienced. And it's based on medical marijuana. You may have preconceived notions about what that means, but please watch the next few minutes with an open mind. I think you'll be astonished at what you learn.
So Charlotte has Dravet syndrome. It's a severe pediatric epilepsy. The seizures when they start with Dravet are status. They don't stop on their own, so they're 20 minutes or 30 minutes or longer. I think her first one was about a half hour. Every seizure after that for 2.5 years was a status seizure, and some were 4 hours long, 2 hours long, and you know at that point she's intubated in the ER in the pediatric ICU, and medicine doesn't stop them. So that's we went through that for about 2.5 years. We got diagnosed at 2.5 years old. A few times her heart has stopped during these using these drugs, and I've done CPR on her, and a couple of those times, you know, I just sort of let go of the fact that just to keep trying with her, and I said my goodbyes to her, and as I'm doing CPR on her or in the hospital, kind of prepared myself for the worst. And she's still here, but she's been through a lot to get to this point. The doctor, you know, she heard her history of seizures at that time and said, we have to pull this, her last med that she was on. Her exact words, we have reached the end of the line with medical options for Charlotte. And I don't know what to tell you, there's really nothing else we can do. Now it's when we met the Stanleys, and that's when we get started on the CBD. After 6 months of, I really didn't think she would survive the seizures, 300 seizures a week, roughly. You know, grand mal, tonic-clonic seizures a week. Just to put in light what 300 a week is, it's about 4 an hour. It's one seizure every 15 minutes. So, you know, sometimes it was every 5 minutes. It just never stopped. And so to see her seizure-free for 7 days, she went 7 days instantly. And we've been on it 9 months, and from that 300 seizures a week, she now has 0 to 1 tonic-clonic a week. And so it's greater than 99% seizure reduction. And it's amazing. It's just absolutely amazing. To think that she wasn't going to survive, and look at her now, she has a life. During that time, she lost the ability to walk, talk, eat, and really just, you know, participate in life at all. She couldn't do anything. She just sort of lied in my arms, catatonic. And I thought that was it. There just wasn't a life for a person. But here we are. I was looking around for, you know, whatever I could find in any dispensary. I met the Stanleys, and they started growing a strain with the highest CBD we've found in the world. And they named it after Charlotte for our success. They named it Charlotte's Web, and that's what we've been using since for the last 8 months.
This particular plant has 0.5% THC and 17% CBD, or cannabidiol, the non-psychoactive ingredient. This plant is so important. The CBD is literally stopping the progression of epilepsy. This plant right here is called Charlotte's Web, after our favorite little precious Dravet syndrome patient named Charlotte. And this is the reason we've spent 2 years developing this plant. The world doesn't know about this yet. We are able to treat Charlotte through doctor-approved channels with no psychoactive effect for Charlotte or any of the patients that are able to take this CBD plant. That's why we call this the future of medical marijuana.
A lot of people think when we tell them what we're giving our daughter, their first reaction is, well, is she getting high? And no, that's not part of it at all. That's a common misconception.
There's no psychoactive side effect, it's not a psychotropic. So, but the CBD does seem to have other side effects that have been amazing actually.
Behaviorally, it's helped her appetite, and I can't think of any possible negative side effect that it has had. She's just experienced a better quality of life all the way around because of it.
To be able to control seizures the way that this evidently is able to do in a condition which results in absolute uncontrolled seizure activity is unprecedented.
Because of this medicine and these high CBD plants, we have our daughter back. We have a life back. She has her life back.
Good job.
Alright, we're not gonna watch that.
Zakai has a rare catastrophic epilepsy diagnosis
We're
called.
not gonna watch Sakai. One of the things that I do want to mention about that, and probably most everybody in here already knows, possibly not. Charlotte's Web is not the only high CBD strain. They don't have a lock on it. There are about 40 other strains that I know of across the United States that are being utilized in California, Oregon, Washington, Canada, Michigan, besides that. So we're not limited to that, but we can breed specific plants, and that's our resident expert over there on that. So I'm not gonna bore you with that, what I wanna do. Hi, come on in. So what I'd like to talk with you about is the 5,000-year history of medicinal use, and bringing into it some of the politics of how we got to prohibition today, and why we even have to fight to have access to this a medicine. It's finally back into the 21st century where people are realizing the benefits that cannabis offers us medicinally, holistically. In the first part of our presentation, we're going to look at its historical use. And then in the second part, we'll talk about some of the studies and the commissions and the findings that came from those studies. Cannabis sativa is one of the oldest agricultural crops. It was cultivated as early as 6000 BC in China. It's grown all over the world, and it's been valued for its medicinal benefits, its fiber properties, and as a food source. 4000 BC, textiles were made of cannabis in China, and we have found some remains of hemp fibers from that period. 2727, we had the first recorded use of cannabis as a medicine. The Chinese pharmacopoeia of Shen Nang, one of the fathers of Chinese medicine. He was prescribing cannabis tea for gout, rheumatism, malaria, and oddly enough, they used it for poor memory to assist in that. In 550 BC, the Persian prophet Zoroaster gave cannabis first place in the sacred text, the Zendavesta, which listed 10,000 medicinal plants. In 100 BC, we have our first written Chinese cannabis and mulberry paper, and that's where we see the first psychotropic properties mentioned, and that book there is called the Pensal. Finally, as we get over into the AD, Roman Emperor Nero's surgeon Dioscorides praised cannabis in the first Materia Medica. So in every time that we saw a establishment of a book, cannabis was always listed in it. Around 600 AD, the Germans, the Franks, and the Vikings, they were all making their maps out of cannabis paper. And the drug's popularity as a medicine spread throughout Asia, Middle East, down the eastern coast of Africa. Certain Hindu sects in India were using it for religious purposes as well as stress relief. In 1563, Queen Elizabeth decreed that landowners who had over 60 acres must grow cannabis or face a 5-pound fine. King Philip of Spain followed the lead of Queen Elizabeth and ordered cannabis to be grown throughout his empires, which would be modern-day Argentina all the way to Oregon. All of the European powers were particularly interested in growing cannabis, and so laws were made. The recipients of land grants in the new colonies, including the United States, New England colonies, were required to devote a portion of their land and labor to growing cannabis because their maritime and naval depended on the hemp fiber, the cannabis fiber. In 1753, we see the first classification of sativa, and that was by Linnaeus. And Linnaeus published a system for classifying all living things, and that's pretty much developed into the modern classification system we've used today. And in 1783, indica was classified. And what we don't really see a lot of, or is more unknown, is the ruderalis variety, which is mostly found on the Russian continent.
Do you know if that was used for different purposes or anything else, or
What do you mean?
the rooterous strand, or was it just a strand that wasn't very hardy to?
It's short and fast growing.
Yeah, I mean, North Africa, Russia grew it, but having like talked to people who have claimed to have smoked it, they said it was somewhere between being not high and a headache. So
So more of a hemp. You're
Yeah.
thinking more of a hemp?
it's shorter,
Right.
bushy fiber.
So it was closer to like a hemp.
Yeah, I think that's
It's one of the other things that I want to mention here is that hops is also in the same family. Again, not necessarily an intoxicant until it's processed properly. By the late 18th century, early editions of the American Medical Journal recommended cannabis seeds and root for the treatment of inflamed skin, incontinence, and venereal disease. And Irish Dr. William Ashanti first popularized cannabis's medical use in England and in the Americas. He was a physician with the British East India Company, and he found that cannabis also eased rheumatism and was helpful against discomfort and nausea in the case of rabies, cholera, and tetanus. And it's also important to note that he was one of the first clinical trials of cannabis on these patients, or human subjects, I guess. In 1857, Smith Brothers of Edinburgh started to market a highly active extract of cannabis indica, and it was the basis for a number of tinctures. In 1850, cannabis was listed in the U.S. Pharmacopoeia as medicine for various ailments. In 1854, the United States Dispensary said that the extract of hemp acts as a decided aphrodisiac, it increases the appetite, it occasionally induces a cataleptic state. It produces sleep, it allays spasm, it composes nervous inquietude. And it says the complaints to which it was specifically recommended were neuralgia, gout, tetanus, hydrophobia, epidemic cholera, convulsions, hysteria, mental depression, insight. And this was the the dispensary saying that. In 1860, the first governmental commission study of cannabis was conducted by the Ohio State Medical Society. So we've been doing a lot of studies for 150 years. In 1890, Queen Victoria's personal physician prescribed cannabis to ease her menstrual cramps. And he said in the first issue of The Lancet that cannabis, when pure and administered carefully, is one of the most valuable medicines that we possess. In 1893, the Indian Hemp Drug Commission concluded that cannabis has medical uses, it has no addictive properties, and it provides a number of positive emotional and social benefits. They convened this study because of the colonialism that was going on. Britain was in the West Indies, and they felt like their labor was not being productive enough, so they wanted to use this study to find out if their use of cannabis was hindering their productivity. By the end of the 19th century, 2 to 5% of the population was addicted to morphine unknowingly because of products like Dr. Fenner's Golden Relief or the People's Healing Liniment for Man or Beast. So they started at that point, about that same time, to develop synthetic drugs like aspirin and chloral hydrate and some barbiturates. The drugs, although they were more chemically stable than some of the cannabis tinctures that were available back then, they were also bringing on their own new set of problems. About 1,000 people died the first year from aspirin-induced bleeding. Barbiturates were a little bit more dangerous than that. And so to prevent more of the country from being washed over in a morphine-induced golden relief phase, the government introduced the Food and Drug Act of 1906. At that point, it didn't apply to cannabis. Cannabis was not under its control. It merely brought the distribution of opium and morphine under a doctor's control, but it was the beginning of the regulation of chemical substances and the beginning of the American drug policy. During the early decades of the 1900s, we see individual cities and locales start to eliminate or implement prohibition of opiates and cannabis to discriminate against lower social classes and immigrants. There's overwhelming documentation to relate this drug use to violent and bizarre behaviors. And it was unlimited. It was the Mexican, the Chinese, the Native American, post-Civil War slaves. I mean, nobody except Anglos were exempt from the stereotyping of that. This particular story, you can see crazed from smoking weed. Basically, it says, not long ago, a man who smoked a marijuana cigarette attacked and killed a policeman, badly wounding 3 other officers. 6 policemen were needed to disarm him and march him to the police station where he had to be put into a straitjacket. That was 1905 in Florida. So the Western states had developed significant tensions because of the influx of Mexican Americans. With the revolution in Mexico in 1910, we had a lot of that spill over into the border, and cannabis was very familiar along those border towns. And first to note that was the El Paso law enforcement, where they put a local ordinance banning the sale and possession of cannabis. During that same period of time, Randolph Hearst, the nice guy who was producing all of these crazed publications, had 800,000 acres of Mexican timberland seized by Pancho Villa. So he really did have an axe to grind in demonizing these people. And again, you can see this was 1915, the Mexican nation locoed by a peculiar weed. In 1916, recognizing that timber supplies were going to be finite, the U.S. Department of Agriculture issued Bulletin Number 404, which called for an expansion program for cannabis to replace the use of timber. It had designed a process that would turn the hemp purge, or the woody pith of it, into paper. As a result of that, in 1917, the decoritator was invented, which would literally strip the hurd and the fiber very easily. And by 1918, the U.S. pharmaceutical farms were growing about 60,000 pounds of cannabis. 1925, the governor of the Panama Canal issued a study into the use and effect of smoking marijuana on its military personnel, with their main purpose of that was to secure a program for regulations that would be used for forbidding the cultivation, possession, or sale of marijuana. The study found that the influence of marijuana had been greatly exaggerated and that there was no evidence that it had any deleterious influence on the person using it. Didn't matter what the studies were finding. It didn't matter that we were using it in great quantities. The government, the Interstate Narcotic Association, was discouraging the use of cannabis, describing it as a drug that would incite insanity. The first experience. See some more of the other sensational anti-marijuana. And basically this led to the outcry for cannabis prohibition, which came into the way of Harry Anslinger. Harry Anslinger, he was appointed the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics in 1930. This was a subsidiary under the U.S. Treasury Department. Pennsylvania has a wonderful history of relation to cannabis prohibition. Harry Anslinger went to Penn State. His wife's uncle was Andrew Mellon, who was Secretary of the Treasury at the time Harry Anslinger was appointed to the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. So in 1937, Harry Anslinger has, one of the congressmen proposed H.R. 6385, which was the Marijuana Tax Act, and congressional hearings were held to talk about the harms of marijuana. So despite the findings of the 1894 Indian Hemp study and the 25 Canal study or the zone report, the fact that it was the third most common ingredient in patent medicines, Harry Anslinger maintained that marijuana was an addictive drug which produced insanity, criminality, and death. So of course the AMA came in and had their chief lobbyist. This is Dr. William Woodward. He was a doctor and a lawyer. And he testified before the House Ways and Means Committee and stated that the AMA knows of no danger of the use of cannabis. At the time, it had been in the U.S. Pharmacopoeia for over 75 years and was found in 28 patent medicines. The American Medical Association opposed the tax because it was imposed on physicians who prescribed cannabis, pharmacists who sold cannabis, or any of the farms who cultivated or manufactured it. And you can see part of the problem that happened, they didn't even know that they were supposed to attend this hearing until 2 days prior to it happening because it was put out as marijuana, and no physician had ever even heard this word because cannabis had always been referred to as cannabis. And so you can see that he said the word or the term marijuana is a mongrel word. I personally don't like to use it. I know that it's interchangeable at this point, but it's important to realize where it came from and why it is, not the correct term to use when you're talking about it. This was the Marijuana Tax Act. Regardless of the American Medical Association's dispute, they decided to go ahead and pass it. The birdseed industry, however, knew that removing hemp from an aviary diet was going to be very detrimental to its evolution and to its homeostasis in the world. And so the conservationists, the Sierra Club, and there was a couple of other ones, they actually were able to get hemp seed exempted from this law because it was important to the birds. It wasn't important for us, but it was definitely important for the birds. And that is the reason that you can still get hemp products today in the United States. It's because of the birds. So thank the birds if you take any kind of hemp supplement. During this same period, we're having these tax hearings. DuPont patented nylon. He patented the process for making chemical plastics from oil and coal extracts. He also patented a new bleaching process to make paper from wood, regardless of what the U.S. Department of Agriculture said 20 years earlier, that we needed to not do that. DuPont advised his shareholders to please invest in his new petrochemical industry because he claimed that the government would force acceptance of these new industries. So we kind of see that there's a banking angle, there's an oil angle, there's a paper angle as to why people would monetarily benefit with the eradication of a hemp fiber. But we'll learn a little bit more about that here. In 1938, Popular Mechanics magazine declared hemp the billion-dollar crop. Unbeknownst to them, the Tax Act law passed while they were writing their article, and it was still out anyways. Then in 1941, Popular Mechanics revealed Henry Ford's plastic car that was made using hemp. Basically, the entire body of the car was made from flax, spruce, and hemp pulp. And it was 10 times stronger than steel at the time. And this particular car was fueled also by hemp oil. So, I'm sorry, forget. Basically, the text of that says, here's the auto that Henry Ford grew from soil. Its plastic panels with impact strength 10 times greater than steel, was made from flax, wheat, hemp, and spruce pulp.
BMWs are still made with hemp too.
Yeah, no, they've gone,
The interior, anything is wood and a BMW is hemp.
Well, with the implementation of the Marijuana Tax Act, cannabis fiber pretty much had production had ceased to exist. However, the United States Department of Agriculture really had to implement the Hemp for Victory program because we were short on industrial fibers that we were dependent on from other countries. And so they began encouraging farmers to grow hemp. Hemp for Victory was a video teaching them the history of hemp, hemp products, how they were grown, how it was processed. However, once the war was over, this program was abandoned. The Tax Act once applied once again, and it made cannabis production non-existent. So what happened to the science and the research after the Marijuana Tax Act? Because we didn't hear from Henry Ford anymore about plastic vehicle parts made from plant. A chemical process had been patented to do that. Cannabis herds were not used for paper because there was a chemical process to do that too. Cannabis was not considered for energy to replace coal or extracted oil, even though this plant matter fueled Henry Ford's first Model T. It wasn't just his 1940 car, it was his very first Model T was fueled by hemp oil. Well, the lie that won't die. We just don't know enough about marijuana. Despite the government's nearly century-long prohibition of the plant, this is one of the most investigated drugs materials out there. There are over 20,000 published studies about cannabis. You can go to the government repository for peer-reviewed scientific literature, pubmed.gov, real simple. You can type in marijuana, you can type in the word cannabis, you can type in cannabis and cancer, you can type in cannabinoids. But if you just typed in cannabis, you will get about 17,000 references. If you type in cannabinoids, you'll get about 12,000 references. I have a sheet up here. This is 4 pages of just links, front and back, that are just complete studies on cannabis and epilepsy and seizure. Compared to hydrocodone, how many people have heard of hydrocodone? Ever taken it? There's only 600 scientific reviews on hydrocodone. So you're taking something we probably don't know enough about. I'm trying to think, I'm sorry. Studies have revealed that we have over 60 active compounds that are likely to possess therapeutic properties. Prior to its removal from the pharmacopoeia in 1942, studies were being done. They were being done actually in the late 19th century. The first plant cannabinoid, CBN or cannabinol, was isolated from a red oil extract of cannabis in the late 19th century, and that was further elucidated, I'm sorry, I think that's R.S. Kahn in the 1930s. It was chemically synthesized in 1940 in the laboratory of R. Adams in the U.S. and Lord Todd in the U.K. So again, keeping in mind 1940, we're in 2014. The second phytocannabinoid, CBD, or cannabidiol, was obtained from cannabis in 1940, also by Adams. THCs were first extracted in 1942, I think by 4 or 5, Woolner, Machnett, Levine, and Lowe. In 1938, LaGuardia was mayor of New York, And he assigned the New York Academy of Medicine to investigate the premise of marijuana prohibition. He wanted to know, people in his city were smoking. The government claims it's going to make them crazy, and they just weren't seeing that. So he paneled 31 scientists, physicians from the city department hospitals and clinical research, did a study on 77 patients. They had a sociological study that was done by the New York City Police Department. Again, this was 1938. The marijuana report refuted claims that had been made by Hearst and Anslinger, and said that cannabis caused no violence and had other positive results. Anslinger responded by denouncing LaGuardia and threatened doctors with prison sentences if they were to carry out any more research with cannabis. A key chapter of that report came from Dr. Alan Tuck and Carl Bowman. It was the psychiatric aspects of marijuana intoxication. And they basically refuted the Federal Bureau of Narcotics' characterization that marijuana was an addictive drug that led to insanity. So that was the psychiatric aspect of it, and they again refuted what was being said. Some of the research that was done on behalf of the LaGuardia report was done at the Cornell Medical School, the chemistry at the University of Illinois, and some of the results that came out of that was CBN had much lower potency than THC as a psychotropic agent, and that CBD lacked psychotropic activity at all. And again, that was in 1940. There was another experiment that concluded the same findings. So we've known CBD is not psychotropic at all since 1940. I have a copy of this up here. Where cannabis and epilepsy are concerned, we know that during the 19th century, several medical reports were published on the improved effects of cannabis oil. We had on several forms of convulsions. In 1842, William Ashanti, 1843, Dr. Shaw, 1878, Sinclair, Gowers in 1881. So it was a consistent history of application and seizure. But in 1947, the anti-epileptic properties were studied again, but this time they were studied on children. And they took Dr. Gene Davis, and Dr. Ramsey conducted a study on 5 institutionalized children whose seizures had failed to be controlled by phenobarbital, dilantin, and mesotoniin. These drugs are still used today to treat seizures. The study found that at least 3 responded at least as well as they had to any previous therapy. The 4th became almost completely seizure-free, and the 5th was seizure-free after the use. And again, that was 1947. They said, except for a brief period of paranoia in one of the subjects, and they didn't have their paranoia until like 3 weeks after the treatment had stopped. So they really couldn't be conclusive, but they said that no other psychic disturbances or toxic reactions had been manifested.
Did they identify the cannabinoid that treated the epilepsy?
I'm going to.
It's a combination that's most effective.
It says here,
Of all of them,
it was 2 isomeric 3 homologs of THC. That was not CBD, it was THC.
For these studies, are they usually like eating a tincture, or they're not smoking, are they? Especially with children.
Well, I can't.
The early studies were tinctures, yeah.
Tinctures.
It wasn't until like the 60s or 70s they actually started doing controlled smoked clinical trials. But,
Yeah, I would definitely say tincture was probably used in the
Because as you were talking
1947.
about the medicines, there's over like 100 types of cannabis tinctures available, so you can take your pick.
For different issues?
Mhm.
For different.
Many for the same issues. And the tax act that she talked about too, the $1, $5, $10 may not seem like much, but at the time you could go into a pharmacy and take your cannabis tincture for a penny, and then suddenly it became $1 a pen, which was way out of this 1930s one, way out of most people's ability to even
And it
afford
wasn't cost effective.
Yeah.
It just wasn't cost effective from the growing standpoint all the way to the end user standpoint. They just couldn't afford.
But wasn't the tax stamp set up that you had to have the marijuana before you could get your stamp? But if you had the marijuana without your stamp, you were in violation of law, and it was intentionally set up to make it illegal to grow.
Basically, you could never get approval for it, except during the period of time when they had the Hemp for Victory campaign. That was the only time. That's the only reason you were able to see an actual tax stamp, was because of, and at that point, the only place you could get it was from the Army. You had to go and.
What did they use it for?
Well, like the parachute that saved King George Bush the First, when he bailed out of a bomber in World War II, was hemp.
We were making uniform material, all
So
the
they weren't
uniform-
using it for medicine, they were using it for fabric.
Textile, yeah.
Correct. Prior to that, prior to its removal from the pharmacopoeia, we were producing 60,000 pounds of medicinal cannabis in the United States farms. Okay, so you do have two different kinds. You have a medicinal and you have an industrial variety. All right. This is actually our
I'm sorry.
No,
It's
it's
such
okay.
a fun conversation.
It is, and you're more than welcome to jump in. He's our expert on the
You're doing a
properties of
really
it.
good, this is
Well,
really
good, because I
history.
want to talk to you. Seriously, I'm a hospice nurse, and one of the biggest issues I have in hospice is pain relief without cognitive changes.
We'll
You're gonna
have
love
a chance
this
to talk
stuff.
about that
Okay,
later on, yeah.
Yeah.
Can I go
Did I
there?
meet you in Harrisburg?
No.
Okay, all
You
right.
might
I've got
have
another
been.
hospice.
I'm gonna go to the ladies' room now.
Okay, that's fine. In 1945, Newsweek reported that over 100,000 Americans used cannabis. Okay, prohibition had been in for 8 years now, so we were still smoking. In 1951, the United Nations Bulletin of Narcotics Drugs estimated that 200 million cannabis users worldwide. So by 1961, Harry Anslinger, wonderful guy, headed the U.S. delegations at the UN Drug Conference where the new international restrictions were placed on cannabis, aiming to eliminate its use worldwide within 25 years. Okay. In 1963, Anslinger was forced into retirement by President Kennedy. So he served from 1930 until 1962 against all of the science that was out there. He just used conjecture. Well, the structures and the stereochemistry of CBD and Delta-9 THC were elucidated by Raphael Mechoulam in Israel. I think it was 1963, and in 1964, it was first isolated from cannabis. The laws surrounding cannabis had stifled a lot of the research. And at the time when he did this study, and I think this is a kind of a cool thing, he didn't realize that there was actually a way or a program for him to get his cannabis. So he went to a friend who worked in the National Police and got some confiscated.
Former student.
It was a,
It was one of his former students. Yeah.
so he got some confiscated, material, and it's because of that that we that's led us to the great advancements where we are today. Further years of collaborative research showed that cannabis compounds activate specific receptors in the brain, just as chemicals do in the body. And they work with the receptors to protect against many of the symptoms of illness that we have. 1970, the Marijuana Tax Act was deemed unconstitutional. And so they kind of replaced it with the Controlled Substances Act of 1970. And cannabis was classified as a Schedule I drug. Drugs in this category are distinguished as having absolutely zero medicinal value. I'm probably pretty sure that everyone here understands what that means. Cannabis is as equally dangerous as heroin. It clearly defined all of the cannabinoids that could possibly be found in cannabis, which again, if you look back at what we already talked about, we knew in 1940 CBD was in no way psychotropic, but that it had healthful beneficial properties.
So a little fun game you can play. So schedule 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Where is cocaine on this? If you had to choose. Huh?
Schedule 3.
Yeah, so again, it's still available, you can still technically write, I think it's Schedule 2, actually, you can still technically
It's
write a
Schedule
prescription, write a prescription for it. What about amphetamines?
Schedule 3.
Schedule 2 as well, yeah, so, like, think about any, like, drug you think is harmful or addictive.
Let's talk about
Yeah.
Schedule 3. What's a Schedule 3? A steroid. I mean, we all know, heard of people that go on, steroid delusion and that's a Schedule 3. Schedule 4 is a steroid. No.
Yeah, well, but also Schedule 3 is now where oral THC is, so you can get Marinol or generic kind of synthesized THC.
We're going to talk about Marinol too in just a minute. Valium is actually a Schedule 4. So Valium, we've heard how highly addictive, how highly dangerous. However, it's a Schedule 4. And then as I talked about, Schedule 5 is a hydrocodone. The most lenient classification. Going back to the epilepsy, numerous studies of the anti-epileptic performance of cannabis properties have been carried out since the 66 years, since that 1947 study. Most of the studies had to revert to animal models of epilepsy where they imitated grand mal, cortical focal, and some complex partial seizures. Studies have found that cannabinoids perform well when compared to the standard anti-epileptic drugs. One of the studies published in 1976 compared the anticonvulsant effects of CBD, CBN, and THC with 7 of the most common anti-epileptic drugs. And the results showed that CBD was as effective or as effective as 2 of the drugs and even more effective than 3 of the drugs. THC, CBN performed slightly worse than CBD, although they were still effective in most cases. That's CBN, I think that's a good one too. In spite of the differences that were observed in the 1976 study between the different cannabinoids, other animal studies found that just plain crude extracts led to strong anti-epileptic effects too. So, for example, a study published in 1978 found that 200 milligrams per kilo dose of cannabis resin at a 17% THC was 100% effective in stopping seizures. Okay. However, a 50 milligram per kilo dose seemed to have no effect at all. Okay, so I'm just trying to see. Despite the overwhelming support from researchers for human studies to be conducted with medical cannabis, it has not been tested on patients with epilepsy in the United States, with the exception of the 1947 study. However, in 1981, researchers in Brazil did a human study, and it was a random controlled placebo trial where 15 patients suffered from secondary generalized epilepsy. The patients were selected based on their lack of response to the traditional treatments. 8 patients were given 200 to 300 milligrams of CBD in addition to their normal anticonvulsant drug, and others received a placebo. At the end of the study, 4 out of the 8 patients that received the CBD became seizure-free, 4 out of 8. 3 showed improvements. In contrast, only 1 of 7 patients on the placebo even showed any measurable improvements at all. So despite all the research that has shown minuscule negative effects and all the potential of positive non-toxic results, there's a systemic denial of the safety and efficacy of cannabis therapy where epilepsy treatment is concerned. Back to, I hate to keep kind of taking you back and forth, but you were looking at this conflicting information that's going on. During the 1970s and 80s, after cannabis was added to the Controlled Substances Act, NIDA, the National Institute of Drug Abuse, was charged with future studies and sole control of any cannabis used in research. And this directly conflicted with any of the research and science and the medicinal value of cannabis, because NIDA's sole mission was only to apply science to more fully understand drug abuse and addiction. So they didn't care about the medicinal value of it. Researchers and drug companies have to get FDA approval before they can begin a clinical trial. Or when it comes to cannabis, you have to not only get the FDA approval, you can have FDA approval, and then you have to ask NIDA for their, you're probably a little bit more versed on that too, but you have to go through an extra step. We're stuck in a study for PTSD where we can't get medical cannabis because they pick apart the application so bad that if you don't have an addiction part of the study in it, then they're just not interested. So you really have to, we really struggle. And NIDA's monopoly deters privately funded research because financial sponsors are not going to invest millions of dollars without a steady supply should their research produce a drug at the end. I mean, they don't have enough to, they're just kind of stuck. In 2010, a spokesman for NIDA told the New York Times that as the National Institute on Drug Abuse, our focus is primarily on the negative consequences of marijuana use. We generally do not fund research focused on the potential beneficial medical effects of marijuana. And these are the people that are charged, who are solely, you know, the gatekeepers for cannabis to be used in research. They do not have an interest in medical studies and won't give it to it. So that's a direct conflict, and these are things that when you hear, well, we should wait for the FDA, these are moot arguments because we've waited on the FDA.
So what's the answer to that?
That the drugs has to have the power to reclassify, I think.
We'll talk about the cannabis monograph. We'll talk about how it's being done. Because there's a way, because that's for, when you think about the FDA, you're thinking about single drugs. They don't regulate botanical medicines. Well, they regulate botanical medicines, but they're not in the business of making botanical medicines or approving botanical medicines. That's not what the FDA does. So cannabis is still a plant. It's not we're not talking about isolated drugs. Well, it's a complicated, it's a thorny issue, but
yeah.
we'll
Okay, because my question is, how do you get it out of the hands of the IDA?
We start demanding that we understand the system and that it's wrong,
Okay.
and that's all. I mean,
Okay.
basically, we just have to tell them we understand it now. It's wrong, and you're stifling progress. Research was allowed using cannabis until about 1978, despite its designation of not having any medicinal use. Got a particular patient, and I won't go back into the history of that, sued the government saying that cannabis was the only thing that would treat his glaucoma. He won, and his medicine was provided to him, this can that you can see here. He received 300 rolled cigarettes a month. There are still 4 patients alive who are enrolled in this program. It was discontinued in 1992. In 1991, it was brought to light that cannabis would treat AIDS wasting syndrome or HIV wasting syndrome, so where people weren't eating. And so they had an influx of applications. And it was at that point that Dr. Mason, head of the United States Public Health Service, is quoted as saying, if it's perceived that the Public Health Service is going around giving marijuana to folks, there could be a perception that this stuff can't be so bad. It gives a bad signal. And so the program was discontinued, and the people that were already on it were allowed to stay on it. And I recently had my picture taken with Irvin Rosenfeld's tin last year, so it's kind of cool. Although I have to tell you, when I opened the lid, it's really smelled like tobacco. It was the most low-grade stuff you had ever seen. When Muslim and his colleagues isolated THC in '64, they made it possible to further understand the complex nature of the endocannabinoid system. I won't bore you to death, but we do know that the location of the cannabinoid receptors throughout the body, red and yellow, are the densest areas. What I think is important to note here is that we go back to the contradictory application of the law. where our government is concerned. Our government owns patent number 6,630,507, and it is issued to the U.S. Health and Human Services on February 2nd, 2001. It lists the use of certain cannabinoids found within the cannabis plant as useful in certain neurodegenerative diseases as Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and HIV dementia. And they specifically list those. So if you've had a loved one who has suffered with Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or dementia, your government has held the patent knowing that this medicine would help them. And I find that to be insulting and inhumane. The global war on drugs has failed. It's stifled meaningful examination and research about the potential medical benefits, and it has generated extraordinary levels of violence, crime, and corruption while failing to reduce the availability of it and the use of it. I mean, we all know that illegal drug use is not coming down. According to the Drug Policy Alliance, 1.53 million people were arrested in 2011 on nonviolent drug charges. The number of Americans incarcerated in 2011 in federal, state, and local prisons was 2.26 million, or 1 in every 99 adults. The highest incarceration rate in the world. If we go back to epilepsy, 1 in every 100 people in the state of Pennsylvania have epilepsy. So we're incarcerating the same amount of people, 1 in every 100 is being held on a nonviolent drug charge in this system, and the same amount of people are suffering from epilepsy. There are currently 20 states and the District of Columbia who have legislation that offers some type of medical cannabis. I don't want to say program because some only offer an affirmative defense, which means if you're arrested with it, you have a legitimate medical use. You still have to go through the process to defend yourself. However, you can present a medical argument. 15 of those 20 states allow for home grow by the patients, and 2 states have completely legalized recreational use. So as we've learned that cannabis has been used for 7,000 years for food, clothing, fiber, medicine, the last 100 years of prohibition cannot be undone. But I think that in the future, the way that we approach our cannabis understanding and the policies that surround it, we should make sure that they're grounded in science and compassion and with a focus on health and human rights. And that's where I'm at. And I'm pleased to offer Jehan Marcoux to talk about his...
Yeah, well, let's give a round of applause to Amy. 30,000 years of information about hemp plants and cannabis plants, so really good job.
It was hard to narrow down. I mean, I could go on, and I could have went with any one of those slides and talked for an entire day. So it's hard to kind of...
Yeah. So there was one other anti-marijuana famous person that was not in this really good talk. So it's sort of like every anti-marijuana proponent seems to come out of Pennsylvania. One of them was in the same university I got my PhD from. I got my PhD studying cannabinoids and cannabinoid receptors at Temple University. And until the 60s, there was a guy, James Munsch. Dr. Munsch was the U.S. appointed marijuana expert. And even his views on marijuana were too extreme for the government, to the point where they basically said, tone it down. Because he would go on trial to convict people of marijuana insanity from using marijuana. He was sort of there for aid of the prosecutor. And one of the things that fell out of his mouth once, and this is all public record now, one of the things that fell out of his mouth once during a trial, this is someone's life on the line. Imagine you're convicted of smoking marijuana in public and you're looking at 10 to 20 years in jail. And the U.S. expert on marijuana gets on trial and helps the prosecution by saying, yes, marijuana makes you insane. I've tried it myself. In fact, it turned me into a bat and I flew around my office and landed in an inkwell. Actual quote from a trial. Yeah, so no shortage of strange.
Bad testimony there.
And then someday, if you really want to see something weird, try and find Henry Anslinger's grave. You can't find it; it's hidden because it keeps getting defaced, which is slightly rude and inappropriate. But
I'm sorry, there were 2 weeks ago, there was another hearing up on Capitol Hill where the drug czar was invited. You might have seen some of his ridiculous answers. But one of the things the drug czar was asked is, does he know who Harry Anslinger is? Now, he said, no, I'm sorry, I've never heard of him. Thinking, yeah, I'm pretty sure that if you worked for the FBI, you'd know who J. Edgar Hoover was. So I would think that you would know who the father of your entire basis. And he sat there, and I'm trying to figure out, was he lying? Or was he really just that uninformed? And should we have somebody running our drug policy who
But when did having to be informed have anything to do with your position in government? At least American government.
True. What happened?
oh no. Go by itself. All right. Okay. So, my name is
Is it
Jake.
going? Do you want me to stop it? Is it PowerPoint?
No, it's
It's your own.
yeah. Let me just exit out of this. Sorry. Ever since Steve Jobs passed away, nothing seems to work. Okay. Yay! There we go. Sorry about this. So my name is Jaywon Marcoux, and the title of my talk today is the AHP Cannabis Monograph. I'm going to tell you all about the monograph. It's a document that basically provides standards of identity, purity, looking for contamination. It's being used right now to regulate cannabis, to audit facilities that manufacture, dispense, produce, and also laboratories that test cannabis. So it's a very important document. So I got my PhD at Temple, studying cannabinoid receptors and the role of the endocannabinoid system in bone. That's my email. I'm now part of this company, Green Standard Diagnostics, and right now we're helping to sort of regulate cannabis in the United States. You can reach me on Twitter at @JayHunMarcoux, and I also have a Science and History of Cannabis discussion group on Facebook that you're welcome to join. Just started it up. So for this presentation, I'm going to start you off with a nice slide. Next slide's going to be on key concepts. Takeaway messages I want you guys to think about for this presentation. I'm going to talk to you about cannabinoid receptors, some really nerdy, in-depth molecular 3D modeling of the receptor, what it is, what it does, what's the difference between a synthetic cannabinoid or cannabis-like compound and a natural one. We'll learn about those types of things. We'll learn about what the receptors are used for, where they're found. And I'm going to talk about hot topics. What's all this stuff about CBD? Is it psychotropic? What does psychoactive mean? Sometimes people throw this word around, non-psychoactive, and I think this is the biggest misconception there is. CBD is psychoactive. You know how I know? Because the word psychoactive, psycho means brain, and active means active. And so if it's crossing the blood-brain barrier and interacting with brain cells, I think it's psychoactive. It's not psychedelic. So when people say, oh, it's non-psychoactive, they're like, no, these are both psychoactive compounds that are both getting into the brain. We're going to talk about botanical medicine regulation, because in order to understand what's going on with medical cannabis and cannabis in the United States, you have to understand the history of botanical medicine. And then I'm going to talk about these two documents that are going to be coming to medical cannabis states near you. The Cannabis Monograph, it's already been published, and like I said, it's being used right now to audit businesses. In Washington, they're using this document to walk into facilities and say, are you analyzing your cannabis with a method that's verified? Where are you getting your results from? Are you following methods to eliminate contamination? You know, these sorts of basic good practices. And you know, if you don't think it's a big deal, think about this. If you were getting cannabis for someone you loved or for yourself, and you saw one that said tested for pesticides and one that didn't have anything on it, which one would you rather ingest or have your loved one ingest? And then we're also going to talk about the monograph part 2, the therapeutic compendium. I'm going to show you some slides from this, from both of these actually. So you're going to get to see, if you hang in there, you get some really awesome pictures of cannabis And then we're going to talk about some really great clinical trials. There's been a lot of clinical trials on THC and marijuana, especially in the last 30 years. So, key concepts. First one is that cannabinoids, which is THC, mimic the effects of the system within our body. It's called the endocannabinoid system. If you've never heard of the endocannabinoid system, it's okay, but just think of opiates, right? Why do opiates have an effect on us? Because we have endorphins, the endogenous opiate system. So much like, it's not just because there's a plant out there is why we have the receptor. That's just a weird freak of nature. We have these receptors in our body because they're part of an important system that regulates things. And so when you take a cannabinoid, you're stimulating the system, you're mimicking the effects of what the body does. The runner's high is thought to also be associated with activity of the endocannabinoid system, not just endorphins. And one of the really, I think, important things is that mutations in this system, what we're talking about are proteins, really. So we're talking about receptors or proteins, the enzymes that make the drugs that activate the receptor or proteins. And so when you have mutations in these, this can disrupt the system. I'm going to show you some fun, what I think are cool slides, which show descriptions of the mutations. And just to give you a little teaser, for instance, there's a study that came out looking at mutations of parts of the endocannabinoid system for bulimia and anorexia, and they found that, wow, this system that when you stimulate it, that regulates appetite, when it's messed up, it's found in people who are suffering from appetite disorders. And it's also thought to underlie other treatment-resistant diseases such as epilepsy, fibromyalgia, migraine, etc. And I think that our future of treating these diseases depends heavily on how well we understand this endocannabinoid system. Another take-home message, basically that's distilled from the first 2 points, is recreational versus a therapeutic. Now, what are we talking about when we talk about medical cannabis versus like a healthy person using cannabis? And this is something you have to think about when you're reading research papers. And I'll give you a really easy example, a driving study. Driving study, you give a healthy person cannabis in a driving study, they don't perform dangerously, but they don't perform generally as well as when they're sober. But you give someone who has muscle spasms cannabis, they perform a lot better at driving. So if you think about it, like instead of like if you have like multiple sclerosis or a spastic disorder, instead of like this movement, you can do a nice easy turn because your spasms are controlled, right? So when you think about healthy versus therapeutic effect, you're talking about someone who's suffering a disease where there's something wrong with the endocannabinoid system, give them a cannabinoid, you're just raising that system up to the level of what a normal person experiences. Think about age-wasting syndrome. They don't have an appetite. And you give them a system, you stimulate that up to the level that it's supposed to be. When you're healthy, you're getting the right amount of signals telling you what to eat, how much to eat. And that's why if you're really healthy, you don't have a problem when you take cannabis. You get really hungry, so hungry that you think you're going to die if you don't eat anything. So that's what we're talking about, different levels of stimulation. So another thing I want you guys to memorize is CBD is psychoactive, but not psychoactive like THC. It goes into the brain, it has activity in the brain. It does not activate cannabinoid receptors, surprise. So it has a completely different mechanism than THC, completely different. One of the really weird things that floats around is this thing about the USP, the United States Pharmacopoeia. Everyone throws this, I've been guilty of it in the past too, is just kind of glossing over this. So they say, oh, the cannabis was removed from the US Pharmacopoeia in 1942. Okay, wow, that seems really like prejudice, but it was with 100 other botanical medicines. Basically like clean slate, getting rid of a bunch of botanical medicines. And all those botanical medicines had to be reintroduced. And so this has been an ongoing battle of validating plant medicine and getting it reintroduced into the United States. And the USP is not a government body. It's a private company that gives guidance to the government. This is how you regulate echinacea. This is how you regulate St. John's wort, which was removed from the US Pharmacopoeia along with cannabis. And so 2 of the societies or organizations that I am involved with are the American Herbal Pharmacopoeia and the American Herbal Products Association. And they create the standards that government use to regulate all botanical medicine. And